all of you here today. I, Madhuri Halwasia, Ehsaas woman of Lucknow, request you all to settle down for us to start the event. May I request everybody to please switch off your mobile phones or keep them in silent mode. Celebrating a new book on the horizon gives many reasons to cheer, more so when the words in the book have come from the prolific pen of a man who commands colossal presence in the world of politics and literature. Today, ITC Shonal is shining bright as eager literary enthusiasts of Kolkata are awaiting the unveiling of yet another fascinating literary creation of a man who straddles multi-dimensional worlds of experience as an author, orator, and a politician. We have here with us today a master of wits and words, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. To celebrate Dr. Tharoor and his newest book, Ambedkar, A Life, Prabha Khaitan Foundation has curated an amazing book launch event under the wing of its stellar initiative named Kitaab. Today's event is supported by Shri Cement Limited as their CSR initiative. Today's Kitaab with Dr. Shashi Tharoor is indeed a special moment for all of us who cherish a common love for literature. Dr. Tharoor's biographical on Baba Saheb Ambedkar is a treasure trove of the life and ideologies of a man who shaped the Constitution of India. In the book, Dr. Tharoor speaks about the story of Ambedkar with amazing lucidity, insight, and admiration. Dr. Tharoor will be in conversation with conversationalist Mr. Suhail Seth. Before we moved to the cherished conversation between two amazing personalities, may I kindly request Ms. Shraddha Saraf, Chairperson FICCI Flow Kolkata, to come on the stage and deliver the formal welcome note.
Thank you, Madhuri. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be a part of an amazing literary event being staged in Kolkata, a city which cherishes love for literary creations and celebrates prolific writers. It is my pleasure, privilege, and honor to be hosting the launch of Dr. Shashi Tharoor's latest book on Dr. Ambedkar's life. Let's get ready to get an insight from the author himself. Can I please request Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Suhail Seth to kindly join me on the stage. Let us welcome Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Seth with a huge round of applause. I, Shraddha Saraf, Chairperson of FICCI Flow Kolkata, welcome you all to a spectacular book launch. The Foundation, in association with FICCI Flow, ITC Sonar Kolkata, and Ehsaas Women of Kolkata, has curated today's book launch event to unveil Dr. Shashi Tharoor's latest book. Words fall short as I take the privilege to introduce Dr. Shashi Tharoor. Dr. Tharoor is a man of global eminence. He truly straddles multiple worlds of experience as stated by Madhuri. His command over the world of Indian bureaucracy, diplomacy, politics is unparalleled. He is a highly erudite person and is a writing genius. He is a prolific author and his bouquet of literary creations include both fiction and non-fiction. Dr. Tharoor is also recognized authority on India, especially regarding its recent economic transformation and future prospects, globalization, freedom of the press, human rights, literacy, culture, foreign affairs, and many more. His columns, articles, and reviews on varied issues of India and global world are enriching and thought-provoking. In conversation with him is Mr. Suhail Seth, who is a notable Indian businessman and columnist. He is the founder and managing partner of the consultancy firm Counselage India. He has a commanding presence as a columnist, actor, keynote speaker, and a TV pundit. Mr. Seth currently serves as the Chairman Marketing Committees of Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, and the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, FICCI. He is also on the Experts Committee of Indian Railway Board. May I now request Ms. Isha Datta, Ehsaas Woman of Kolkata, to come up on the stage and felicitate Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Mr. Suhail Seth with the Madhubani Dupattas of Bihar. Presenting the Madhubani Dupatta is an event in Bengal which represents Prabha Foundation's zeal to showcase Indian handloom and textiles as a part of its cross-cultural endeavour across different cities to promote and preserve Indian textile heritage. A strong foothold in the world of literature, art and culture. Back in 1980s, late Dr. Prabha Khitan, who is also an eminent literature and cultural enthusiast, founded the non-profit trust with a cherished dream. It was her mission and vision to create cultural capital through activities and endeavours that propagate literary and cultural assets of India. Guided by the golden philosophy, Karma Hi Jeevan Hai, the foundation grew in stature and recognition as an organization that gives the best platform to writing geniuses and showcases the marvelous cultural heritage of India. Inspired by the philosophy of the nation, university and diversity, Prabha Khitan Foundation curates boutique initiatives that present the kaleidoscopic diversities of India. The foundation leaves no stone unturned to present before a niche audience the marvels in the world of literature and culture. That includes music, dance and storytelling. Performing arts and likewise. The foundation cherishes the noble patronage of Sri Cement Limited and close association of distinguished associates, collaborators, partners, Ehsaas Women of India in creating landmark events on the global map. Allow me to introduce Vicky Flo of Kolkata to some of us who are not members. FLO is the women wing of the Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. FLO was established in 1983 as a division of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, which is the apex body of industry and commerce in India. An all-India forum for women, FLO has its headquarters in Delhi, with 18 chapters covering different geographical regions of India: Ahmedabad, Amritsar, Bangalore, Bhubaneswar, Chennai, Coimbatore, Hyderabad, Indore, Jaipur, Kanpur, Kolkata, Lucknow, Ludhiana, Mumbai, Northeast, Pune and Uttarakhand. With over 37 years of experience, FLO has been promoting entrepreneurship and professional excellence among women through workshops, seminars, conferences, training and capacity building programs. The objective of the organization is to encourage and felicitate women to showcase their talents, skills, experiences and energies across sectors and verticals of the economy for a truly inclusive economic growth trajectory. It feels so good to have the Prabha Khitan Foundation and the Ehsaas Women with FLO today. This event wouldn't have been possible without their support. This year, as the chairperson of the FLO Kolkata chapter, I believe when we join hands is when our voices are amplified and its effects multiplied. Hence, our theme for this year is true in itself. Mission is fly together. Over to you, Mrs. Mukasia, to take us to the further proceedings of the day.
Thank you, Shraddha. May I now request Ehsaas Women of Kolkata, Ms. Malika Verma, Ms. Gauri Basu, Aisha Datta to come up on stage along with Ms. Sangeeta Datta, Ehsaas Women of London, and Ms. Shraddha Saraf, Chairperson Fiki Flo Kolkata, to join in. Of ITC Shonar, Ms. Anandita Chatterjee, Executive Trustee of Prabha Khitan Foundation, and Ms. Basavi Fraser, our Associate from Scotland, to join us on the stage for the book launch ceremony.
We live in a very unforgiving country. A good, intellectual, deeply honest man stands for the election of presidentship of his party and comes away with a broken foot. There can be nothing more torturous.
He's implying I shot myself in the foot.
I didn't say that. It is so sad that we don't see him with one of India's finest public intellectuals walking every day, but that too will happen. I have to say that FLO is far better organized than the men's organization that Vicky has. Because I believe Subrakant Panda has just taken over as the president of FICCI. It's the same 5 people since 1942 who welcomed the incoming president. YK Modi being one of them. They give the bouquet of flowers to the same people. I mean, it's the same 5 people. If you miss them, you know it's not FICCI. It used to be like that with CI. But with Flow, there's a certain energy and an intellectual heft that is so heartwarming. I mean, how many people in Delhi would ever be there for a book launch? That too on Ambedkar. And if it had to do on, Meghan Markle, perhaps. But Ambedkar, very few. I mean, look at Calcutta. That's the spirit of civility and intellect that needs to be. And the other remarkable thing is Calcutta always claps for itself, which is a great thing. It's heartwarming. But I want to cover the book on a serious note. Absolutely. I am a Calcutta. Thank you. As if I needed a reminder. Not. So yeah. And don't get too itchy. We have only begun. So I want to talk about the book. I've read 3 books on Dr. Ambedkar, and Shashi's is the 4th. It is unarguably one of the finest books, and I'm not saying this because the author is here. You should buy this book for 3 reasons. Number 1, it contextualizes the person who we have credited the making of the Indian Constitution for. It paraphrases, it profiles, it puts in context the enormous intellectual struggle that Dr. Ambedkar had to wage with people who were his contemporaries, which included formidable people like Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. It also tells you that while a lot has changed, nothing has. And I think Shashi, in part 2 of the book, very eloquently captures the concerns that every Indian should, must, and will hopefully have about a democracy which doesn't allow for dialogue, about a country that doesn't allow for free speech, and a nation that hopefully wants to engender hate instead of affection for political expedience. So it's in that context that you must read the book. The 2 things that I took away, which I hadn't taken away from other books, was the enormous amount of intellectual wealth that Dr. Ambedkar had in himself. And the other that I was telling him, and I happen to have done both those plays, this man was perhaps one of the most complex individuals from a mind perspective, and combined the complexities of Richard III and Salieri in Amadeus. Because such was the thing. So let me start, Shashi, and I don't want to give too many things of the book away. Let me start by asking you, why this book and why now?
So first of all, thank you for those kind words, introductions, Will. I really appreciate them. I'll give you a 4th reason as well, which is that the book is mercifully brief. It's just 200 pages long, and I did that deliberately. If some of you may be familiar with my earlier autobiography I've written is of Nehru, and I did the same thing in that one too, which is that I took a large and complex life that looms so large in our national consciousness, and about which so much has been written that it's too much for anyone to digest. And both of those individuals were themselves so prolific. They made so many speeches, wrote so many articles and books, that at the end of the day, by their own words, they have generated so much that every good biography of them, there are many good biographies of both Nehru and Ambedkar, would be multiple volumes long, or 700 pages and counting if you try and do it in one volume. And especially in today's TikTok generation, the WhatsApp generation, no one's going to read any of those substantive biographies, and I thought it would be good to actually write something short and accessible to today's young people, which actually stands a chance of being read because of its length, but which at the same time tells you everything you must know about the life, and at the same time tries to interpret the legacy. So I did that for the Nehru book, and I'm glad it's been well received over the years, and I thought I'd have another crack at doing that for Ambedkar. So when Suhail asks, why Ambedkar? Well, I think, when you realize that there is probably no other Indian who has more statues to him around the country, then perhaps Mahatma Gandhi might have slightly more, but this is already contested because somebody has argued, and no one has been able to contradict him yet, that there is no village in India without a bust or a statue of Dr. Ambedkar. And in these circumstances, he probably is the most revered Indian. And he's also somebody whose stature has grown enormously after his death, which is not true of some of the other great figures of our times. One could argue that, in fact, pretty much everyone else looks smaller with hindsight as history has come and supplanted them and other people have come and replaced them. But Ambedkar has grown in stature. And I think it was time now. He lived only 65 years. He passed away at the age of 65. It happens to be exactly 65 years since he passed away when I embarked on this book. And I thought, why not try and take stock of his life at this time when a man who in his own lifetime was so reviled and attacked and criticized that he lost more elections than he won, when this man is now so iconic that every political party wants to lay claim to his heritage, even the ruling BJP, whose political philosophy Ambedkar had reviled. And it's interesting to see this happening. I thought, why not find out what did he stand for, what did he believe, what did he write, and what today might we find important to recognize what he accomplished. So that's what I'm trying to do.
So it's interesting because you do mention the fact that there were two things. One is he possibly had more statues of himself. There are more statues of him across the country, but you also mentioned that outside Parliament, there's only Gandhi and him in terms of statues. But there's a very interesting point that you alluded to just now, and the book covers it. He was a deeply bitter man towards the end of his life. One was obviously the successive defeats in 3 elections, the fact that he had to come to the Rajya Sabha, the fact that he had to almost decry, deny, disown the constitution that he wrote by saying that I was just a hack. Why do you think that happened when there was so much going for him? And what was the inflection point between the time when he was first taken into the cabinet as the Minister for Labour, much to everyone's annoyance, and when he first came into government under Nehru? What was the inflection point for Dr. Ambedkar's deep disappointment with life, and more importantly with the Constitution itself?
Well, by the way, Labour was under the Viceroy. The Viceroy's Executive Council, but the portfolio he was given by Nehru in the first cabinet was law, and he stayed in that. But as you know, he resigned, and he resigned over a particular issue, and that was the Hindu Code Bill. I mean, today we might think that why was there such a big problem about it? Well, there was. When he tried to introduce the Hindu Code Bill, he was massively opposed by the Congress party itself, the ruling party, and I believe slightly unfairly, he felt that Nehru had not fought hard enough for him. Nehru did fight, but the traditionalists in the party still had very much the upper hand in those days, and they were very reluctant to proceed with reforms as far-reaching and ambitious as Ambedkar had wanted. And after 2 or 3 setbacks, Ambedkar resigned in protest. And then the manner in which he was treated after his resignation was truly shocking, in that it is a constitutional right for a departing minister to give an explanation of his resignation to Parliament. But he wasn't allowed to speak on the grounds that he had not submitted the text of his resignation speech in advance, which was certainly not a formal requirement. And so even the manner of his resignation became so bitter that he stayed away, and then he kept denouncing people. He did have a few chips on his shoulder, which, given the life he led and the privations and discrimination that he overcame, is not surprising at all. In fact, no less than Eminence and Mahatma Gandhi said that we should be grateful that he doesn't want to break our heads, given what he suffered. So there was a certain a bitter edge to some of his feelings of being unjustly treated. But there was that, and the resignation. And then in the years afterwards, he felt increasingly that our democracy was going in a certain direction. Yes, political and civil rights, yes, and more economic rights with the abolition of zamindari and so on, but not touching social rights. And he said essentially that you are building a palace upon a dung heap, that you are creating a society that you consider more progressive, more economically just, and so on, but you are doing so without touching in any meaningful way the social discriminations and inequalities in our society. And that's something else that he was very, very bitter about. As you know, probably the final thing he did of any major significance, just a few months before his death, was to abandon Hinduism altogether and convert to Buddhism. And that too was also a measure of his disillusionment with everything that he tried to do politically, socially, and in his life. He not only converted to Buddhism, he also announced the establishment of a new political party, the Republican Party of India, which in the end has survived, but which he didn't really have very much to do with because he passed away very soon after he announced his creation. The thing about Dr. Ambedkar is it was entirely possible that he might have had yet another sort of revival. Maybe in the 57 elections he might have made something of the Republican Party, and perhaps one, who knows? I mean, it's very difficult to imagine what would have happened. But he was gone at the end of 56, and he was gone in bitter manner, so well said. He really was bitter and disillusioned with a lot of things that he felt had let him down in our society.
So just to give all of you perspective, and when you read the book, you'll figure it out. There were some very important points in Dr. Ambedkar's life, but 2 years were very, very significant, 1927 and 1932. 1927 was significant because at that time Dr. Ambedkar did 3 things. Number 1, he burnt copies of Manusmriti. Number 2, he took a march, he marched with some people to Chowdhury Tank and actually said that we're going to drink water from there. And the third is that he was elected to the Bombay Legislative Council, which then gave him authority. Shashi captures this period brilliantly, and I just want to mention this so that we can get a perspective from him. 1927 was when Ambedkar decided that he needed political weaponization to further the cause of what they were then called the depressed classes, what we called, and Gandhi, in order to subvert the whole thing later, gave them the name Harijans and actually started a magazine called Harijan. 1932 was even more critical, because Gandhiji, on 20th of September 1932, went on a fast unto death. And it was imperative for Ambedkar to call on him in prison to ask him to call off the fast. And that is where the first fissures between these two giants actually occurred. Because Ambedkar's point, I don't want to quote from the book, but Shashi's point is that Ambedkar's entire belief was that we will not be dissociated from Hinduism. We were born Hindus, but we weren't given a place. So the whole Varnashram, if I can pronounce it right, the class, the tier system, which Gandhi was a great proponent of, which Ambedkar fought. And I think that part, to my mind, is brilliantly done. And it should be mandatory reading for people to understand that India is not a poor country because of poverty, but because of the impoverishment of opportunities. And that impoverishment of opportunities was Ambedkar. And he will tell you in the book, the 2 biggest supporters were the Maharaja of Baroda and of Kolkata. Over to you.
You see how there's a lot of things in what you said, Suhail. Suhail's right about both the importance of 27. Ambedkar was just 36 years old at that time, but he became, with the events of that year, the foremost leader of what today we would call the Dalit community. And then in 32, the British, after the Round Table Conference in London, decided to accept Ambedkar's proposal for what is called a communal award, that is, in a forthcoming legislature in colonial India, it would still be under British rule, there would be reserved seats for Dalits, for which only Dalits could vote. In other words, that you would divide the Hindu electorate the way the British had divided everybody else. You know, we had, in those days under the British, Muslim voters could vote for only Muslim candidates for Muslim reserved seats. Hindus, similarly for Hindu seats, and then there were general as they were called, and then the rest, Christians, Anglo-Indians, Europeans who settled in India, whatever, they could vote for a separate set of seats. And so the electorate was divided by the British anyway. It was also a very limited electorate. They had such rigorous requirements. They had literacy, obviously, then they had property ownership, and as a result, barely 10% of the adult population was able to vote. In fact, as late as independence, we didn't have the universal franchise. It was just a very small percentage of people in the final British legislation, that is the Government of India Act 1935, in a country of about 300 million people. We had about 30 million people entitled to vote. I know not all 300 million were adults, so it's a little more than 10% of the adult population, maybe closer to 15-20% of the adult population was allowed to vote. But that's what we're talking about. But even within that, Ambedkar's feeling was that if the depressed classes, as they were called, the Dalits, had to fight in seats, for seats against Hindu candidates with Hindu, general upper caste Hindu vote banks, that there was no way that any of the Dalits would get elected or have their voices heard. And so he asked for separate representation. And the British, persuaded by the force of his arguments in London at the Round Table Conference, decided to grant it. Gandhiji went on a fast unto death against that. Gandhiji said that I will not allow the Hindu society to be divided like this. Untouchability is a sin, but it's a sin that Hindus must expiate themselves. And we don't want to do it by dividing our society and treating Dalits as different from the rest of us. So the final compromise in the Pune Pact, as it was called, when Ambedkar went and came under enormous amount of moral pressure because Gandhiji was fading very fast from his past. He was literally on the verge of perhaps even going into a coma and then passing away, which would have, the country would have erupted in flames if that had happened, and the victims would have been Dalits. You remember what happened in '84 to our Sikh brothers and sisters. If the Dalits were blamed for Gandhiji's death at the peak of his fame, you can imagine what would have happened. So Ambedkar surrendered, and the compromise in the Pune Pact was there would be Dalit seats, a certain number of reserved seats, but the electorate would not be divided. So you still, to get elected, needed a majority of non-Dalit voters amongst the Hindu community to vote for you if you wanted to be a Dalit representative. And he saw that personally as a defeat, but he felt he had no choice, that he had to give it to Mahatma Gandhi on this. So it was a period where he was both of tremendous stature and visibility nationally, and at the same time, a period that he saw as a setback and of a defeat. And afterwards, he became quite bitter about Mahatma Gandhi. Between the Pune Pact in 1932 and Gandhiji's assassination in '48, Ambedkar said a lot of very nasty things about Mahatma Gandhi, and he continued doing so after Gandhiji's death, which is something I felt was unnecessarily ungracious of him. Gandhiji, on the other hand, had tried to be respectful, understanding, and even somewhat accommodative. And as late as 1946, when Ambedkar even published a couple of books, one of them had the title, What Mr. Gandhi Has Done to the Untouchables, and so on. Ambedkar and Gandhi even wrote him a letter saying, tell me what I need to do to bring you on my side, to have you working with me. But Ambedkar could not be modified. And you can trace it, as Sohail says, to this particular episode in '32, where Ambedkar felt he suffered a defeat, and he refused to be defeated by Gandhi again. So he became more and more and more critical over the years. It's when you write a biography of a man like Ambedkar, these are sort of, if you like, the dramatic inflection points. And it's really quite remarkable when you think of this man. He's 22 years younger than Gandhi, and he's not, they're not contemporaries. They're contemporaries, they lived at the same time, but they're not peers. Initially, was Ambedkar first called on Gandhi a couple of years earlier. Gandhi had no idea whether didn't even know he was a Dalit. He saw this well-dressed guy in a suit, and he assumed it's one more of these Brahmin reformists who were standing up for the rights of the poor. And it took him a while to realize what was going on. That's when Gandhi began to understand this chap has suffered terrible things. He's overcome a great deal, and that's something Sriyal and I haven't yet talked about, is how much he was able to overcome, given the fact he was the 14th child of a subedar in the army, born in a cantonment town. In those days, retirement age came very young, so his father was out of a job soon after he was born, and father had to go and get post-retirement work further away in order to be able to support the family. Many of the children died. Ambedkar himself, by the way, ended up burying 3 children. So he had himself suffered. His infant mortality was horrendous in those days. But Ambedkar, having suffered all of this, overcame it all entirely through the sheer weight and dint of his intellectual brilliance. Now, Sriyal is right in saying there were 2 Maharajas that were helpful. And Sriyal doesn't mention there were also some Brahmin teachers and so on who saw this boy's potential and helped him. First of all, a teacher in the little primary school he went to. And this is a school, by the way, where this boy had to sit on a gunny sack at the back of the class, rather than in a desk in the front, as his merit and his marks would have justified. And he was thrashed once for daring to touch the water tap because he was thirsty. And he couldn't find the peon who was authorized to pour water from a distance into his cup. And he went and turned the tap on himself, and he got suddenly thrashed. How dare you, an untouchable, touch the tap? So these are the kinds of experiences Ambedkar had gone through. But there was a Brahmin teacher at the school called Ambedkar who gave this boy his name. His family village was Ambedkar, and therefore in the Maharashtrian way, caste Hindus would often take the Gavaskar would be from a place with Gavaskar, so now Tendulkar would be from some place beginning with that. Similarly, Ambedkar was a family name for people coming from Ambedkar, and in any case, his father had never dared to use that. It was an upper caste practice. His father was Ramji Sakpal, and I think the boy was originally registered in school in the Sakpal, but the teacher said, no, you're a bright boy, you deserve to have the same name that I proudly bear, and you would be Ambedkar. So he was registered in primary school as Ambedkar, and that's how he grew up. There's another Brahmin teacher who was not his teacher initially, but when Ambedkar became the first Dalit student at the high school attached to Sydenham College, there was a Sydenham High School in Bombay attached to Sydenham College, he, of course, couldn't have sort of quite all the freedoms that the upper caste students had, but he would, during lunch break or whenever he had time, he would sit in a little garden near the college and read. And there was a Brahmin teacher who used to come and do the same thing. And that guy noticed Ambedkar and started talking to him, was very impressed with the boy's learning and promise and his seriousness about his studies and so on. And this teacher is the one who first went to the Maharaja of Baroda and said, you are somebody noted for giving assistance to poor people, and so will you sponsor this child's education? And that's how Ambedkar was able to get a college degree, becoming one of the very few Dalits with a college degree in those days. And then he also got from Baroda a scholarship to go abroad and study. And he went off to Columbia University in America to study at a time when, even for many upper caste people, that would have been an unthinkable aspiration. But he was supported by the Maharajas. Don't forget, the Maharajas were not Brahmins. And they were not particularly fond of Brahminism either. So they were quite willing to encourage bright people of the lower caste to come up and sort of challenge the caste system. Kolkata as well, after Ambedkar came back, mind you, he came back with a Columbia degree, which so few people had. Those were the days when many upper caste people would write BA failed after their names. Because the fact that they got far enough to try and sit the exam and then fail, or they would write IA, which meant intermediate arts. That is, you've done only 2 years of a college education, you haven't gone through the full degree, but you've got intermediate, so you would write that. Those are the days. Here is a man who's come back with a PhD from Columbia, and he couldn't actually find anyone in Baroda to rent a home to him. He couldn't stay. Finally, he had to pretend to be a Parsi and take a room in a Parsi boarding house. But sure enough, the local Parsi community soon found out there was an imposter. And they came in and threatened him with hockey sticks and so on. He had to go out, and there he was, for all his qualification, reading in books, sitting in a park with his books and papers strewn around him at his feet, weeping tears of bitterness because he couldn't find a place to stay. And he resigned his job in Baroda from the Maharaja and went back to Bombay and struggled, but he was going to try and overcome that kind of humiliation. So he did get help from Maharajas like that. Maharaja Korapur later helped him, and he went back again later to study in England. And he was an extremely well-educated, was probably the best educated politician we've ever had in the country. But he suffered a lot of indignity in the process, even though he also had help from people of other castes and communities. He had the leg up that he went. In fact, one of his sponsors throughout his life was the man who was his class, he was roommate at Columbia. It was a Parsi from Bombay called Naval Bathena, who obviously had no caste prejudice since he wasn't a caste Hindu himself, but who liked Ambedkar and lent him money, both to get through Columbia, but subsequently when he came back to Bombay, when he resigned the Baroda job, he thought, well, let me put my legal studies to some use, I'll try and practice the law. Even to get a license to practice law, you needed to pay some money that Ambedkar didn't have, and Naval Bathena helped him. All of these things. So he did have people helping him throughout his life. And I think that must have made him feel that the entire world isn't as unjust and all that. There are people you can. But everything he accomplished was in the face of tremendous discrimination, hostility, and humiliation. And he overcame it by the strength of his character, his hard work, and his intellectual brilliance.
You know, when you go through the book, you'll discover a very interesting comment. Amartya Sen said of Dr. Ambedkar that he was my first economics guru. And there's a very interesting discussion or a standoff between Gandhi and Ambedkar. Gandhi always believed that we needed to curb consumption and therefore reduce demand and put pressure. Whereas Ambedkar was amongst the first proponents of a free market, as it were. And what Shashi does mention brilliantly is the academic rigor that Ambedkar brought to everything, including the fact that, he's talked about the Hindu code of conduct. Ambedkar's constant refrain was that we cannot be part of a set that has abused our existence and denied us opportunities all our lives. So that won't change. In fact, Shashi talks about the round table in his address, and he says that 1/5 of the population, which is more than the population of Britain and France, was in the so-called neglect area. But I want to take up the indignities and the humiliation. From the book, what it seems, Shashi, is that this man fought against the worst kind of odds. Did he ever believe that he did get his fair share? And to paraphrase Shakespeare, the good is oft interred with the bones, the evil lives long after. In his case, it's just the reverse that's happened. Today you venerate Dr. Ambedkar because he brought logic and intellect to the fore. So, when you were researching the book, and I see from the footnotes there was a lot of work done, and you quote liberally from sources, where do you think his personal or his psychological dilemma lay? Because he had a very tumultuous, not relationship, but what he felt, when his first wife passed away, and the letter that he wrote. Where do you define Ambedkar as the man, in your words or in your thoughts?
Gosh, again, there's a lot of things there to unpack in what you've said. Where do we begin? I think, first of all, there is no question about the humiliations and privations. I was reminded when you mentioned that when he first came and worked in Tharoor with his PhD from Columbia, the Maharaja said, you've written this PhD on economics and so on, very impressed. I should make you finance minister. But since we already have a finance minister, the moment we starting off as military secretary. Here he was military secretary to the Maharaja of Baroda. And the peons who delivered files would not give him a file. They would throw it on the desk because they didn't want to be polluted by even his touch. Imagine if you're holding a file and you're a peon, and Ambedkar receives the file and is holding the same file, someone that's polluting. That was the kind of stuff the man had to go through day after day. So yes, tremendous amount of all of that. Intellectual rigor, absolutely. In fact, he was a very serious economist and highly regarded. His work on provincial taxation in British India was considered a classic. There was no greater authority on that phenomenon than him. He also did some of the pioneering work on the problems of the Indian rupee. The British had manipulated the value of the Indian currency to favor their interests, and Ambedkar was brilliant in analyzing all that. In some ways, he was also a pioneering sociologist. He presented a paper on caste at Columbia, which is probably the first study of caste as a sociological phenomenon in Indian society, and no scholar had done anything comparable before that. And of course, he was a lawyer as well, so his legal understanding of various issues was remarkable. In his 20s, he was invited to testify before various British commissions looking into Indian issues. So, and he rapidly caught the attention of people. The Maharaja of Kolkata, in a speech when Ambedkar was about 27 years old, said that I believe here you have found your hero and your leader. He is going to become one of the great leaders of our country. So people could see his potential young, but of course he had to fight over so many things and so many problems. There's an incident that I described in the book, and the book is obviously much more full of ideas and arguments than it is of incidents, but there's an incident where when he's in the Bombay Legislative Assembly and therefore a prominent Dalit leader, he wants to go to a particular village to investigate some stories of some atrocities there. When he goes there, he reaches the station and he's received by all the people of his community, the Mahar caste of that village. And then he's waiting. And he said, what's the problem? Isn't this place where I'm going to investigate this problem sort of a short walk from here? So they said yes, but no, we're getting a cart. See, there were all these tongas, but none of the tongas at the station were prepared to take an untouchable, however prominent he was. So they waited, he waited, and then suddenly a tonga appears, and he's asked to sit in it. What he doesn't realize is that this tonga, anyway, I'll tell you the story. So they set off, and within a minute or two, the tonga has a near accident. Then it bashes into something, then it hits something else. And within 5 minutes, they're crossing a bridge to go to the place they're going to. And the tonga driver loses control, the car topples over, Ambedkar falls and breaks a couple of ribs and vertebrae and various other things, wrist injures his wrist and several broken bones. And he's furious. He says, what is this? What have you subjected me to? It turns out, of course, that because no tonga driver was willing to drive an untouchable, and for the Mahars it became an article of pride for them that their Dr. Ambedkar would have to arrive at the settlement in a tonga and not on foot. They had told the tonga driver, we will drive the tonga. You let us hire your tonga and we will drive the tonga. And the tonga man sort of charged them an arm and a leg and gave them his tonga. But the chap who thought it was so easy to drive a tonga had no idea of handling either the horse or the cart. And this poor untouchable driver ended up causing the great Dalit hero some very serious injuries. And as Ambedkar wrote, he could have even lost his life because from the bridge he could have plunged into the river instead of falling on the road and hurting himself. So, I mean, these were the kinds of incidents that used to happen to even such a man of great eminence as he. But he continued his quest for authority, and Suhail hasn't yet got to the point, but I'm sure we will, of the accusation of his collaborating with the British and so on. But the fact is that he he was trying to bring about reform in Indian society in the context of colonial rule at a time when the nationalist movement was fighting for freedom from colonial rule, but in his view, not caring enough about the freedom of those at the bottom of the social order. And so his whole effort was to try and get the emancipation of Dalits up on the same par, as it were, as the transcendent drive to free India from colonial domination. And that combination was what led to some of the tensions that I'm sure we'll talk about next.
So also it's interesting too, so as the book progresses, there's a fundamental discourse that Shashi embarks on, saying that Gandhiji always believed that the means were as important, if not more important, than the end. And ahimsa was part of his credo, it was part of his DNA, part of his belief system. Ambedkar, on the other hand, believed in the outcomes. So there was this fundamental issue. He quotes Louis Fisher, one of Gandhi's biographers, and Louis Fisher was extremely distastefully irreverent about Ambedkar. And then obviously in the book you've mentioned the fact that Ambedkar was seen as pro-Pakistan as time went by, pro-British. Ambedkar actually believed that if the British had continued to rule, there'd be greater empathy, there'd be more clarity on the role of the depressed classes. And he generally believed that freedom would just not be a moniker because, and Shashi mentions that, freedom would be real freedom if every Indian was free. And Dalits were not extra constitutional or adjunct to real Indians, which is what, by the way, Hinduism and Hindus made them feel. They made them feel as an attachment, a distasteful attachment to Hinduism, which, by the way, I generally believe has been Hinduism's continuously pernicious misstep, and we continue to make that, but that's for another debate. When you talk about his pro-British and pro-Pakistan and his belief that British rule may have been better, many called him at that point in time anti-national, and many believed that he wasn't a great proponent for India's freedom struggle. One thing Shashi didn't mention now, but which he mentions eloquently in his book, Ambedkar was the only man of stature who did not condole Gandhi's death. He passed no comment, he wrote no letter of condolence, and he never uttered a word when Gandhiji was assassinated on January 30, 1948. Not a word. So over to you, Mr.
He briefly joined the funeral procession, but you're right, he never said anything. And subsequently, after Gandhiji's death, in a couple of interviews to the BBC and so on, he was scathing about the Mahatma. In fact, he said, people worship him as a Mahatma. I only saw the bare man. I saw his fangs, that kind of language. He was very, very negative about Mahatma Gandhi, I think to a point of churlishness. It was unfortunate and unnecessary. But going back to what Zia was talking about, the charge of anti-national was based on the argument that Ambedkar was willing to collaborate with the British if it meant that he could promote the interests of the Dalits. In other words, his argument was, if I just surrender to the Congress Party and Mahatma Gandhi, mine will be lost, my cause will be lost in the larger cause of independence and national freedom, and no one will pay attention to the demands of my people for justice. Whereas if I work with the British, who are after all controlling power right now, they're in a position to give concessions to my people right now, and therefore I can do more for them by collaborating with them. So for example, his work in the Viceroy's Executive Council actually happened during World War II when the nationalist leadership of the Congress Party was in jail after the Quit India movement. And even before the Quit India movement, they'd resigned the offices to which they'd been elected in the elections of 1936-37. But Ambedkar said, it doesn't matter if they call me a collaborationist, I can actually get good things done, and he did. He, as Labour member of the Viceroy's Executive Council, he was able to promote a number of things that improved rights of working men and women, many of whom, of course, were Dalits, but not only Dalits. And he was very progressive in his thinking. He was, as I've written in the book, is probably India's first feminist. Somebody who stood up for the rights of women very early on. And some of the things he said in speeches in the 1930s and 40s, if you read them today, would strike you as extraordinarily liberal and broad-minded by Indian standards. And he was doing that 80 years ago. So this was a man of a very, very progressive ideas and vision, and he thought working with the British would enable him to get these things done. And I would say that's essentially the spirit in which he did that work. But anyway, on Pakistan, which Shashi also mentioned, he simply analyzed the situation. He wrote these books very rapidly, by hand, sitting on his desk late at night. But he was very analytical and rigorous in his analysis, and he basically, the book was called Thoughts on Pakistan. He analyzed the situation and said that given the fact that Muslim society in such and such way sees certain differences and wishes to be politically separate, it's in India's interest to let them go, to those who want to go. I'm simplifying a much more complex book, but the fact that he actually said that India would be better off in the end if those who really want to separate were allowed to separate and create Pakistan, that was held against him as well, especially by the nationalists who wanted to see the country united. There is a rather long book by Arun Shuri, Worshipping False Gods, about 717 pages of I must say, a very wordy polemic against Ambedkar. From start to finish, but the principal burden of Shuri's criticism is that he was a collaborator with the British and doesn't deserve to be hailed as a hero in India. It's striking, by the way, that sometime a few years ago, there was an online poll for the greatest Indian of all, and 20 million people participated in the poll, and it was not Gandhiji who won, it was Dr. Ambedkar. 20 million people voting as the greatest Indian of all time. So when you think about it, he really has achieved a level of eminence he would not have expected in his own lifetime, when he was indeed somebody who was controversial and was politically somebody who had more than his fair share of enemies.
You know, it's interesting, I don't know how many of you have actually followed the pre-1947 period, primarily between 30 to 45. Sarojini Naidu had said of Gandhi that it takes a lot of money to keep him poor. Gandhi, Nehru had a great relationship with industrialists. So did Ambedkar with G.D. Birla. G.D. Birla offered him more money than Ambedkar could have got, he would have got more money for his library, but Ambedkar chose to gift the library to a college that he founded called the Siddharth College because of his conversion to Buddhism. But there's a very interesting anecdote in Shashi's book about Dilip Kumar. Dilip Kumar was an upcoming star, a genuine engager on the politics of the country without any partisanship. And he knew that Ambedkar was in town in the same hotel, and he wanted to meet Ambedkar. His desire to meet Ambedkar was to give Ambedkar some money for the colleges that Ambedkar was endowing. And Ambedkar told the people who were organizing the meeting, saying, I want to have nothing to do with the Indian film industry. Short of saying they're bad people, So he said, I want to have nothing to do with the film industry. And when someone said that, look, he's come here to give you some money, he says, I don't need money from people that I don't respect or something like that. But it's interesting. Stubbornness was his birthmark. And he remained stubborn till the very end. You mentioned Nabat Bathena. You mentioned that towards the end, his meeting before his death, 2 months before his death with Bathena, where he complains about his son and his nephew. Where do you see Ambedkar's stubbornness playing the role in crafting him and creating him in the manner that he became Ambedkar?
Well, I think he had to be tough and hard and stubborn and resistant, because how else, you're being beaten down by all the forces of society around you, all the people of power around you, well, not all, but most of them, and all the institutions of society are also arrayed against you. Surely it takes a lot of toughness and a lot of even what one call bloody-mindedness, or the Americans would call cussedness to be able to face all this, resist all this, and move on. And this is what Dr. Ambedkar, I think, was able to do in order to achieve the successes he did. So I think you have to accept that cussedness came as part of his personality. In fact, to his credit, he recognized it. When he had a second marriage with this lady, Savita Ambedkar, he actually wrote to her mother to describe his character as a human being. It's a charming letter, one of the very few personal letters I've quoted in the book. Another one was when his wife passed away and so on. But his first wife. But this time he actually wrote saying that I'm a difficult man. And he was a difficult man. He acknowledged the truth. But he wrote, explaining that he's not an easy man to look after the like. And there was an element of what can we say, in the marriage. His wife was a doctor. He was pretty ill by then. He married her just a few years before his death. He had diabetes, blood pressure, etc. Modern medications when these were much more uncontrolled. And he was advised by a physician to find somebody to look after him, to cook the right food for him, and to make sure he gets the right medication at the right time, and so on. And then he marries a doctor. You can draw your own conclusions from that. But nonetheless, he was honest enough in writing to her mother to say that, I'm not an easy person to get along with, and I've got my share of character traits that aren't easy. And that's true. He was difficult. He did say a lot of negative things, and he did say a lot of things which hurt people. He didn't suffer fools gladly, another quality of intellectuals that not every non-intellectual is prepared to accept. But he was that way. That, I think, doesn't diminish the scale of his accomplishment and the extraordinary level of it. And when you particularly contrast it with the humble origins from which he came, the indignities and sufferings he overcame, and finally the challenges that he, literally every stage, the hurdles he had to jump over to get to where he got, I think those accomplishments look even more remarkable. The principal draftsman of India's constitution, which is now, a hallowed document, a man who introduced some very important concepts into our constitutional jurisprudence. In many ways, a man whose ability to reconcile the needs of his community on the one hand with the importance of individual rights and freedoms in our constitution. About writing into the constitution the fact that instead of the British deciding everything through communities, like Muslims or Muslim votes and that kind of thing, that we would have individual agency in the country, that each individual citizen of India would exercise rights. That was his contribution. At the same time, the notion of fraternity. It wasn't just the French Revolution's liberté, égalité, égalité, fraternité. It was also the fraternity that he saw in Buddhism, of solidarity amongst people across castes, across classes, across every other kind of social division in India. All of these were, monumental contributions to India, and at the same time, the kind of privation the Dalits were going through for millennia. To be able, you can't just transform that in one lifetime, but the breaches he made in that edifice of discrimination have made a lot of progress and change possible since then. So I think, we are looking at a man of unquestionable greatness, but a flawed human being, and I think we have to understand that these flaws are partly what makes him so interesting as a man and not just as an iconic figure.
With that, we come to the end of this part, and we'll now open it for Q&A. That's what I've been told by the thing.
That's right, we'll let you choose the question.
Yeah, and you can ask any question related to the book, of course. And please announce your names to be known to blame for whatever. And ask a question. If you have a comment to make, just wait outside and you can deliver a speech. There's a soapbox right out. But on a serious note, please, I just end what I began with. It is a must read. The problem with India is we are divorcing ourselves from the knowledge literary pursuit that we should engage in, and more importantly, the historical context that we need in order to grow. And I think it's very important. I'm delighted that Flo and Esas and, all of you, it's said that every child born is a testament that God is still not unhappy with man. I believe every person who attends a book launch is testament to the fact that knowledge is never ending, it's only enduring. Thank you so much. And now we have
It's wonderful to have you both here with us today, Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Seth. Thank you for that. And now, of course, may we have the first question?
Yes, please. Well, I'll come to what Jiddu Krishnamurthy said when he was asked a question. He says, you already had the question planned even before I started speaking. I hope you didn't bring the mic from home. But anyway, ask.
Good evening, I'm Joey Bose. What are the 3 qualities, leadership qualities in Ambedkar that stand out as for you? You've done such amazing research, your insight would be great.
I wouldn't actually focus on the leadership qualities because every party that he founded, he wasn't able to lead. He attracted people and he had followers, but he was not somebody who built up, shall we say, the kind of following that you associate with a leader. He transformed essentially on the basis of his own individual merit. So the changes he was able to bring about in India were the result of his intellectual achievement, the passion, determination, and as we said, even bloody-mindedness of his focus and his drive, and his willingness to even make certain compromises and sacrifices, such as accepting being tarred as anti-national by the nationalists and so on, in order to get what he saw as the more important objectives. But none of those would particularly be described as leadership qualities, because leadership is about bringing a whole lot of people with you. He didn't care in many ways whether he brought people with him as long as he could get what he wanted to achieve for his community.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Go.
I'm Priyanka Shah. So, when you were mentioning about Ambedkar being humiliated in the school, when he drank the water, he opened the tap, right? And that was like some 70, 80 years, 85 years back, right?
No, that's 120.
120 years back. So, then when you were saying this, couple of months back in Rajasthan, there was a similar incident with a 9-year-old boy. He's from Dalit, and he took the water from the earthen pitcher and he was thrashed badly by the teacher and he died. So I just want to know how far we have come with so many years after so much of fight, the Harijat.
Excellent.
That's a fair question. In fact, in my later section, Suhail and I have talked much more about the life and not enough about the legacy. There is a section analyzing all of this, to what degree have Dalits, have their lot in life improved since Ambedkar's time and so on. And I have mentioned incidents. This particular incident hadn't happened when my book went to press, but there were other incidents that I have mentioned. And there are, unfortunately, atrocities against Dalits in many parts of India even today. I would only say that in a country of 1.4 billion people, the number of such incidents has gone down dramatically as a proportion. If you think in terms of what was prevalent in Ambedkar's time, the discrimination and the humiliations were the norm, and decent treatment was an exception. Whereas today, I think it's fair to say that it's these incidents that are the exception, and that's why they get the attention. Believe me, when Ambedkar was thrashed in his school, no media was going to report it as a story of much interest. It was happening daily everywhere in the country. Today, when this poor boy in Rajasthan was treated that way, people rightly report it because it is so shocking to our modern sensibilities. So that's a measure of the change. And I would say that certainly, for example, in urban India, that kind of discrimination is now largely unknown. How do you know the caste of the person who's rubbing against you in the crowded bus? What do you talk about caste when you go to an office and your boss may be a Dalit? You have to take his or her orders, etc. I think that urbanization has transformed it, and many of the more educated and enlightened rural people across our country have also stopped such practices. Certainly in my own lifetime, I've seen in the state of Kerala some significant changes in just normal social behaviors. There's a story of mine which I've written about a Dalit kid, and this was based on something I actually saw throughout my own childhood. You know, I was growing up in Bombay as a kid and being taken back on vacations to the ancestral village every year by my sisters. And so there was a kid who would watch us play, but was never invited to play with us. And whenever I asked why, people wouldn't explain. At one point he touches the ball because the ball is hit or kicked out of our courtyard, and he fetches it. And they instead of thanking him, they're furious with him for having touched the ball. And these are all incidents I've seen in the early 60s. Now, a few years later, this kid is invited to play. So there's already social change happening. So he plays with us in the courtyard, but he's not invited into the house when all the others come in to drink water or tea or have lunch or whatever. And then a few years later, he is coming into the house. A few years later, he's actually even had the freedom to walk into the kitchen, which would have been unthinkable when I first became conscious of his existence. So changes are happening even in rural India, and people's attitudes, you know, enlightenment dawns, and you hear it from society, you hear it from books, movies, exhortations of the public, and so on. And those who are educated tend to understand and appreciate that what they were doing, what they did believe in the past was wrong. But not everyone is like that. Right? We're still not a fully educated society, we're still not a fully literate society. And in some parts, particularly, I'm sorry to say, of northern India, both the treatment of Dalits and the treatment of women leaves much to be desired.
But Priyanka, it's an interesting question. In Shashi's book, he stresses that Ambedkar was very clear that education would be the salvation for the depressed classes. And he kept telling people of his community that unless you embrace education relentlessly, with great vigor, you will not get recognition. See, people can take away everything. They can take away your money, they can take away your home. They can't take away your knowledge. And I'm glad that, you know, now we could have discussed the second part of the book of Shashi's. It took us 45 minutes to get through the first part. And that, to my mind, is the intellectual depth. So it's never the size of the hammer. It's always the brilliance of the nail which you, or whatever. You know, it said 209 pages, and I've read Arun Shoury's book. In fact, we launched it at a YP or an EO event many years ago. That book, to my mind, and I said it then, was more vitriol than research. I mean, he's been very kind to say that, you know, and he mentions in his book about 700 pages. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to change. You know, we still call our people servants. They're help. They're staff. So unless we change, how do you expect society to change? It's very easy to say, hey, you know, I went to the Jolly Rich Club day before yesterday, and our daughter's nanny, who is more educated than some of the people who were there, this person comes and says, you know, she can't sit here. And I saw the pain. And all three of us, my daughter, my wife, and I, got up and left because, you know, we are members, we have to abide by the code of conduct. But what kind of society? You tell me, what would Anushe feel? And we are doing this progressive. We are doing this out of entitlement because, and let me tell you, the people who serve us sometimes are far more educated, but our entitlement breeds so much of arrogance that we believe we can rule. So, and Ambedkar says that with independence, and he mentioned you've replaced one set of feudals with another set of feudals, guised in democracy. Yes, the gentleman with a lot of hair. I'm joking. Nowadays you can't say anything because, you know, these are all gender insensitive things to say. Yes, Yes, my friend, tell me.
Good evening, I'm Rajesh Poddar. Dr. Tharoor, do you think Ambedkar was very fair towards the tribals in drafting the constitution?
Excellent.
No, he wasn't. Actually, I have a short section on flaws of Ambedkar. That's the first one I mentioned. He wasn't. It's odd that somebody like him, who was so sensitive to discrimination and injustice towards his own community, could speak of the Adivasis with the same kind of patronizing contempt that so many upper caste Hindus would have spoken of Dalits. So I'm afraid it's difficult to say, as his defenders say, but those were the attitudes of those days. You can't judge what he said in the 1940s with your attitudes of 70, 80 years later. But the truth is that even at that time there was enough evidence to suggest there were people from the tribal community of great dignity, self-worth and self-respect, including one or two members of the Constituent Assembly. I've quoted a speech from one of them in the book. So I think you're right. This is one area where he doesn't score very well. Another I mentioned already was his attitude to Gandhiji, which I thought, political differences are perfectly justifiable.
Yeah.
But the manner of expressing them and the sort of lack of graciousness was unbecoming of such a great man.
But just to take off from where Shashi left, political discourse in this country has become, it's riddled with hate. You can't build a great nation on hate. You can't build it on divisiveness. You have to embrace everyone. We keep talking about inclusiveness, blah, blah, blah. There's too much of rage. I wrote a piece many months ago saying we're the Republic of Rage. Everyone is angry. I don't know why. Either we're losing our marbles, the atmosphere is so filled with venom. You can't laugh anymore, you can't crack a joke, you can be put behind bars, and it's happening here as much as it's happening in Delhi. So, Mamata is no exclusion. I can't understand. Where has the humor gone? So hopefully that too shall pass. So I'm sorry if I referred to your main, but I didn't mean to. It's just
You're right. I'm not insecure like our politicians are.
Excellent. Yes, please.
Hi, this is Shweta. What provoked you to write a book on the life of Ambedkar? Why Ambedkar, not Why only Ambedkar, not anyone else?
Well, I mentioned this in the very beginning. That was Sohail's first question.
Were you here at the beginning? So then, we addressed this. Okay, yes, ma'am.
So I am Vibha, and when you mention education, I'm in education too. So when we talk of reservation in education, especially higher education, I do understand the intricacies of educating the masses and education for all. But in higher education, reservation can be quite an antithesis. Because we see, because I train for entrance exams, and we see that undeserving students get in and then they bring down the standard of the institution. Teachers, St. Stephen's had this conundrum. So, Gandhi took it to one extreme, but did Ambedkar ever talk of affirmative action? You get it only if you deserve it. I think that's
No, he did talk about affirmative. In fact, he is the inventor of affirmative action in many ways, because what he wrote into the Constitution was the world's oldest and farthest reaching affirmative action program of all. But what's striking is that he guaranteed not just opportunity, but quotas. Reservations mean that the outcomes are guaranteed. So if for example, 85 seats are reserved in Parliament for Dalits, it's not just that Dalits will get an opportunity, it means they get those seats. And the same logic was applied to medical colleges, government jobs, and education opportunities. But he was a man who was prepared to learn from experience, and it's very difficult for anyone today to say that he would not have changed his mind after seeing how these things worked in practice. At one point he wrote a rather trenchant letter about the reservation policy. And he had only enshrined it for 10 years, in fact. So he himself was prepared to review the matter. He didn't live long enough thereafter to be part of the review after 10 years. But I give him enough credit for intellectual honesty and nimbleness of mind that he would quite conceivably have reviewed and rethought some of these things had he lived long enough to do so.
I believe in equality and fairness to all, but I do have strong reservations about reservations.
Excellent. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Linda. I'm sure you've done impeccable research on Ambedkar. I'm curious to know that while making these inroads, you do ever feel that wish you had a direct dialogue with him and there were certain things you wanted to ask him?
Yeah, I think it would be fabulous to actually talk to him. I felt the same way about the other subject of a biography of mine, that was Mr. Nehru. I imagine he would have been the most amazing dinner conversationalist. If you caught him at his peak, I believe in his last years he was quite surly. But certainly early on, apparently he would do great imitations of Charlie Chaplin and so on. So Nehru would have been fun to have dinner with. With Ambedkar, I would have wanted to catch him in a good mood because I think, as you were saying earlier, he could be quite, he would give short shrift to people who said anything that he considered stupid or unjustified. But yeah, the thing about many of these people is you do have a slight illusion of engaging directly with them when you read their own writings. So in the case of Ambedkar, he's written so much. Literally, he's the only man who went on publishing after his death. Because he had written so many manuscripts that were found on his desk that they published another 3 books after he passed away out of material that he had already written down. And so he was somebody, you wrote so much that you could feel that you were actually engaging directly with him. But I must admit as a writer myself that what you write on the page to an abstract, unknown reader is not quite the same thing as sitting and talking to a real human being with their own understanding, preconceptions, and other features which will make an individual conversation always different from a general text of a book.
Priyanka, just to come back to what you were saying, do you know that Ambedkar got the Bharat Ratna in 1990?
Which was
BBC
24 years after he died.
1990. This is how marginalized we made Ambedkar. It is sad that the person, and Shashi mentions in his book, the 6 or 7 members of the drafting committee, 2 were on leave, 1 guy fell ill, 1 guy went for a walk, he was sad with all the work. And this is how this country rewards its people. So many years ago at Ahmedabad, I asked him, I said, who's the Vice President of India? Hamid Ansari was. No one knew. IIM Ahmedabad. I said, what is Hrithik Roshan's pet name? Dugu. I said, that's why we're screwed. Yes, now ma'am,
Excuse me.
we have to go. Yes, your turn. My mistake, I apologize.
What is his pet name?
Dugu.
I've learned something. Nobody's not learning something every day.
Good evening, sir. I'm Meenakshi Gupta. Sir, you being a master of thesaurus and vocabulary, I would want you to differentiate between the politics with Dr. Ambedkar around and the politics now with you around. With a metaphor, if you can, because you are the master in that.
No, ma'am, I think one of the major differences is the intellectual content. Ambedkar, for him, politics was about ideas voted him down, so he didn't get the law passed in the Bombay Legislative Assembly. But this is because he understood the extent to which frequent pregnancies were disempowering women. And so this kind of thing, this is a man who read, who understood, who had original mind, with theories of his own. Some of it was speculated. There was not a whole lot of knowledge about the caste system, and he was speculating about the origins of caste and so on in ways that were certainly based on rigorous reading and analysis, but were not just, he couldn't footnote everything, because some of these were simply the products of his own original thinking. But I will say that the intellectual level of Ambedkar's politics is unmatched today. The kinds of speeches that Ambedkar made, today I don't know if there's too many politicians in the country who can make them or would have the patience to listen to them and understand them and engage with them. So there's no doubt that the intellectual content of our politics has gone down considerably since Ambedkar's time.
Second last question from this lady, and then
Somebody standing with the mic.
the last question. Well, third, second, last. Then we have to. I'm in no rush. Shashi's here till 11 p.m. So you can ask him any question you want outside.
He's being mischievous.
Yes, please. Sorry, I'm so sorry.
I wanted to say that in many ways Ambedkar was an outsider as far as his contemporary politics was concerned. And he was critical of the mainstream.
What's the question?
Yeah, he was critical of mainstream nationalism, just like Tharoor was. So I wanted to know that from your research, have you found out any sort of commonalities between Tharoor and Ambedkar, or did they have a...
They were critical for very different reasons and on different premises. Tagore basically believed in humanity and not in the idea of the nation. For Tagore, he said that essentially what matters is the fact that we're human. And a nation is an artificial construct. You draw lines on a map, it's not right. And yet the same Tagore returned his knighthood to the British after Jallianwala Bagh. He said, I don't want any honours from the British in a moment of national humiliation for my people. So he immediately, by saying that, he was actually undercutting his own thesis of nationalism. Because he was implicitly accepting there was a notion of nationhood to which he was subscribing. So I would argue that Ambedkar was a little more straightforward and honest. He accepted both the idea of community, in which case, in his case, the Dalit community was his first unit of loyalty, and the idea of nation. He wanted India to be free. But there's no question that as an Indian, he felt that the freedom of India was indivisible from his point of view from the freedom of his own people. And he did not want India to be free if it meant the freedom of the upper caste to continue to oppress the Dalits. So to that degree, he was prepared to sacrifice India's freedom until Dalits could be free, that kind of thing. So it's a very different play. It's not that the two are not meeting, they're in two different worlds. I have not seen anything by Tagore about Ambedkar, even though Tagore only died in 1914, when Ambedkar was already quite a prominent figure. And I don't know, frankly, if Ambedkar ever tried to meet Tagore or anything like that. But I'm not even claiming to have read every single word on or about Ambedkar. There's simply too much there. I mentioned that, if you actually published the collected works of Ambedkar, you'd have 17,600 pages. The government of Maharashtra started doing this, and they brought out some 23 volumes. They still have another 23 volumes to go to actually print everything that he's written. So I've read whatever I could. I've not seen anything.
And the remarkable thing about the Maharashtra government is, I don't think many people in that cabinet can even read, but we'll come to that later. Yes, ma'am. That'll be the second last question, right? Perfect.
And Savina Shinglu, the question I have right in the beginning was that you mentioned that he himself decried and was disappointed in the constitution that he wrote. As Indians, we're very proud of the Constitution, and he's the father of the Constitution. So you haven't thrown light on what aspect of the Constitution was he disappointed in. Have I understood this?
Yeah, no, the principal thing that I did mention in my answer was that he felt that the working of the Constitution was allowing the upper caste, as it were, to proceed with far-reaching changes in India without actually addressing what to Ambedkar was a central issue, namely social injustice. So he felt that, for example, Nehru was making far-reaching, the zamindari abolition and so on, economic changes, the redistribution of wealth, sequestering the wealth, tagging taxes, all these things. And there were, of course, political changes taking place, linguistic states were going to come about the year that he died, all of that. But on the social front, he felt that Dalits were suffering exactly as much as they were before, and that the government was not prioritizing it. And this was something that led him to make that famous comment, you are building a palace upon a dung heap. The dung heap being the rottenness of Indian society on which this edifice of liberty and political freedom was being constructed. That was his principal thing. He had said even at the time of the adoption of the Constitution, that we are adopting a liberal constitution as a kind of top dressing on a soil that is essentially undemocratic. because our society has given us a lack of democracy within the way in which we are organized as a society, and we are trying to create a democratic political structure on top of that. So we have to address the bottom problem. And he felt that the government in India was not giving that enough importance.
So it was not the document, it was the implementation that he was disappointed.
Yeah, that's right. And remember, he said in his famous speech that a constitution is only good as the people who work it. That a good constitution can be ruined by bad people, and a bad constitution can be ennobled by good people. So the people who work the constitution and the working of the constitution is what really matters.
Yes, please.
The last question, right? We were supposed to wrap up at 7:45.
Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Seth. I'm Shukla. I heard a lot of discussion about how Dr. Ambedkar used to feel about Mahatma Gandhi, and he was overtly critical. So, during your research, did you come across any personality, could be political or maybe of eminence, who actually inspired Dr. Ambedkar too?
Not as a very, very good question, because when you think about it, I would say probably the answer is no. He was inspired by teachers, philosophers, intellectuals, writers. John Dewey, the American philosopher whom we met and we had read and we had met in Columbia, people like that, and their ideas influenced him. But there was no particular political leader that he would ever hail as a guru. And that's a very good observation. I don't actually say that explicitly in the book, but it's true. There is no particular political leader before his time or a contemporary of his whom he could point to and say, this is an inspiring figure, I'm happy to follow. He didn't follow anybody. And he never acknowledged any particular inspiration from any one person. But in some ways, that loneliness through which he fought his causes was, I think, what made him so great. I mean, he wasn't walking in anybody else's footsteps. He was blazing a path that had not been charted for him by anyone else before. And that's, in some ways, the measure of his accomplishment. I mean, there were well-meaning upper caste people who were trying to uplift Dalits, though they weren't called Dalits. But there wasn't a Dalit leader who was risen up from the community and fought for them and for their rights, while at the same time exhorting them, as Sohail says, to go out and get educated, to learn their rights, telling women not to get married too early, not to have too many children, have the freedom to stand up and demand equality in their marriage, all of these things. He was quite an original, no question about it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Every book must come to an end, and every session has to end on a positive note and with words of gratitude. I now invite Isha Danda, Ehsaas woman of Kolkata, to do the honors and come and give the formal vote of thanks. Book launches have a charm of their own. They provide an opportunity to delve into the minds of authors in relation to their books. Today was another such event, followed by a riveting conversation between two great minds. Today was also a memorable moment for us all in witnessing the unveiling of Dr. Shashi Tharoor's book, Ambedkar Alive. A narrative about a peerless visionary, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and how his greatness remains relevant even today. On behalf of Prabha Kaitan Foundation, I, Isha Datta, Ehsaas woman of Kolkata, express my sincere gratitude to the author, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, and conversationalist, Mr. Sohail Seth. I would also like to thank Vicky Flo, patron Sri Cements Limited, and our venue and hospitality partner, ITC Shonar. Last but not the least, a big shout out to our amazing and receptive audience. Your presence and support made today's Kitaab event a success. Good night, stay safe, and before you leave, you may buy a copy of the book